Squirting. What is it? Is it pee or is it something else? I'm Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon, and today we are going to talk about squirting. Before we get into the video, I want to make sure you guys know about the Rena Malik MD podcast. If you don't, this is a great time to get acquainted with it. We're doing a huge giveaway for just 2 weeks, and we're giving away thousands of dollars of prizes. All you have to do is check out our podcast, subscribe to the podcast, and leave us an honest review. This helps us reach more and more people all around the world who can learn from quality evidence-based education. So check it out on www.renamalikmd.com/giveaway and follow the instructions. It's super simple and takes less than 5 minutes. So squirting is the emission of fluid that's usually large volume, clear, odorless, that comes from the urethra or the area where urine typically comes from during orgasm. Now, before we get into what exactly is this fluid, it's important to understand the anatomy. First off, there is the urethra. Now that is the tube that carries urine from the bladder out of the body, and that's at the top part of the vagina. Now, right underneath the urethra is these glands called the Skene's glands, and these are duct-like structures that sit underneath the urethra that are homologous to the male prostate. Now, what does homologous mean? It means that these organs, the male prostate and the female Skene's glands, were developed embryologically from the exact same tissues. So what that means is that their function has some overlap. And so there is some fluid that is made in the Skene's glands. And when you look at the Skene's glands under a microscope and you stain it for something called PSA, or prostate-specific antigen, which is a screening test we use for prostate cancer and is found in male prostates, we see that there is PSA in the Skene's glands. So again, this is proof that this is like the female prostate. Now, the other important structure involved in all this is the clitoris. The clitoris is part of the vulva. It is the erectile tissue of the female, and it's the only organ in the entire human species that is only there for pleasure. So it's located above the urethra, and it usually has a hood on it, just like the men do who are uncircumcised, who have foreskin. So the clitoris has foreskin, and it's not just what you see on the outside. It actually goes deep inside the pelvis and then has these little wishbone type shape, and the legs actually go around the vagina. So this is another important part because women typically climax, or most commonly climax, from stimulation of the clitoris. So what happens during sexual arousal? Well, there's lots of different fluids that are emitted. There is lubricant, which is emitted through the skin or the vaginal walls that occurs during arousal. And so that is also some fluid that's being created during sex and during arousal. There's also female ejaculate. Now, this is fluid that specifically comes from those Skene's glands. It's usually whitish in texture, and it's about, very small amounts, 1 or 2 drops. And then there's squirting. And so the theory here is that during arousal, the clitoris obviously gets engorged with blood, just like the male penis does. And then during climax, that pressure from the sponge of the urethra and the fully engorged clitoris causes fluid to be released from the Skene's gland. And this is what causes female ejaculation. Now, let's think about this in terms of anatomy. The female prostate, or the Skene's glands, are somewhere between 2.6 and 5.2 grams in weight. When we look at men, their prostate is about 1/5 larger, and that's the average prostate, which is about 23 grams. So let's compare that then from the semen volume that comes from a male. So semen volume is contributed about 5% from the sperm itself, about 1/3 from prostate, and the rest is from the seminal vesicles. And the large amounts of semen volume, the largest amount is about 5 cc's. So we can't imagine that you're getting this large volume of fluid just from the female Skene's glands, but they're likely still contributing. And the reason for this is that when you look at squirted fluid and you look at the chemical compositions in trials, now they've done some small studies on this. Now they found that there is PSA in this fluid. So we know definitely that there's some contribution from the Skene's gland in the squirting fluid. Now that leaves the bladder, right? So here's the question is this just pee coming from the bladder? Because where else would it be coming from, right? It has to be held somewhere, this large amount of fluid that then is squirted out. So one is we know that during orgasm, there's a very strong contraction, and likely it's from the pelvic floor muscles and probably from the bladder, allowing the squirting fluid to come out with such force, because there's really not a lot of organs that can get that kind of force that will allow this sort of forceful amount of fluid to come out. So in that same small study where they found PSA in the squirted fluid, they found that essentially it was like diluted urine. It wasn't really like urine. There was much less urea, and it was overall very, very dilute. And the other question remains is, if you empty your bladder before sex, which many people do, like how is that fluid going to be pee? Well, one theory is that during sex, your blood pressure goes up, right? You're having sex, your body has some physiologic responses to sex. This may then trigger certain hormones like aldosterone to affect the filtration of the kidneys, which then changes the chemical composition of the fluid going into the bladder, making it more clear and odorless. The other theory you can check out from an interview with Dr. Komisarek, where he believes that this is due to imbibition and potentially causing fluid to be released that way. Now, there's two other studies which attempt to answer this question. One is where they looked at ultrasounds. So they basically had people ultrasound their bladder right before sex, and they had some small amount of urine. They then had sex, squirted. These were people who at least had some emission of fluid during sex, and then they ultrasounded them again, and they saw the fluid was now gone from their bladder. So that was one proof that potentially this is urine. Another study looked at 5 women, where these women were having some emission of fluid during orgasm. They put what's called indigo carmine in the bladder. Now, what this is it's just a color, so it turns the urine blue. And they had them stimulate and squirt, and lo and behold, blue came out with the squirt. But these are, again, really, really small studies. And I've actually received messages from my audience saying that, you know what, no, I take medications that turn my urine orange, like Pyridium, which is people use for urinary tract infections, and I don't actually see my squirting to be orange. Or I take methylene blue, and when I pee, my urine is blue, but when I squirt, it's clear. So bottom line, is squirting pee? I think the answer is no, it's not pee. Is it coming from the bladder? Yes, it's also coming from the Skene's glands, but it's distinctly different from pee. It's more dilute, it doesn't have the same concentration as pee, and probably there's people who do have urine leakage, or what we call coital incontinence when they squirt, and others who don't. Bottom line, it doesn't really matter. Squirting is something that some people do, some don't. If you want to learn how people actually feel about squirting, check out my video on squirting, where I talked about a survey where they actually talked to women who squirt and how they felt about it. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you are worth it.